The wind in Siberia does not just blow, it screams. It cuts through layers of wool and fur, finding the smallest patch of exposed skin and turning it numb in seconds. In the winter of 1918, in the middle of a forest that felt like the edge of the world, a finger tightened around the frozen trigger of a Springfield rifle. The man holding it was not Russian, and he was not American. He was a Filipino, thousands of miles from the humid rice paddies of Iloilo, standing chest-deep in snow, staring into the barrel of a Bolshevik partisan's gun. The silence between them was louder than the howling wind, a fragile, terrifying pause before the inevitable eruption of violence. In that moment, death was a certainty. But what happened next wasn't a firefight. It was a melody. This is the story of how a song stopped a massacre. To understand how a tropical islander ended up in the frozen wasteland of the Russian Far East, we have to look at the chaos of the early 20th century. World War I was bleeding Europe dry, and the Russian Empire had collapsed into a brutal civil war. The United States, along with other Allied powers, launched a massive, confusing intervention known as the American Expeditionary Force Siberia. They needed bodies, they needed soldiers who were disciplined, and they needed them fast. So, the call went out to the Philippines, an American colony at the time. The Philippine Scouts and Constabulary were elite units, tough and battle-hardened, but they were men of the tropics. They were volunteers who signed up for adventure, completely unaware that they were marching toward a climate that was alien to their very biology. The journey from Manila to Vladivostok was a transition between two different planets. The soldiers left behind the scent of Sampaguita and the heat of the sun, boarding transport ships that carried them north into the graying waters of the Pacific. As they disembarked in the Russian port city, the first thing that hit them was the air, sharp, dry, and painfully cold. For many of these young men, this was the first time they had ever seen snow. Historical records describe their initial reaction as a mix of childlike wonder and creeping dread. They touched the white powder tentatively, watching it melt on their brown skin, realizing that this beautiful substance was also their new enemy. They were issued heavy wool coats and fur hats that felt heavy and suffocating, a stark contrast to the light cotton uniforms they wore back home. Their mission was vague and dangerous: guard the Trans-Siberian Railway, protect supply depots, and maintain order in a region where law had completely evaporated. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. The Bolshevik Red Army and local partisans blended into the civilian population, striking from the treelines and vanishing before the snow could settle. The Filipino soldiers, famously friendly and adaptable, found themselves in a landscape of paranoia. They were the strangers, in a land of wideouts, viewed with curiosity and suspicion by the locals. They were brown-skinned men speaking a mix of Spanish, English, and Visayan, trying to navigate a geopolitical chessboard that even their generals didn't fully understand. Every patrol was a gamble. Every shadow in the forest could be a man with a grenade. Life in the barracks was a battle against a crushing sense of isolation. When the sun went down, which happened terrifyingly early in the Siberian winter, the darkness was absolute. The cold seeped through the walls of their billets, a constant physical presence that gnawed at their bones. To keep from going mad with homesickness, the Filipino troops turned to their most potent cultural weapon, music. In the Philippines, music is not a hobby, it is a way of life, a vessel for every emotion that is too heavy to carry in silence. In the evenings, huddled around cast-iron stoves, the sounds of guitars and bandurias would drift into the frozen air. They sang kundimans, traditional love songs that are dripping with melancholy, longing, and a profound sense of devotion. It is important to understand the psychology of these soldiers. They were colonial subjects fighting for a colonial master in a third country civil war. They understood displacement in a way the American officers never could. They knew what it felt like to be underdogs, to be far from the land that buried their ancestors. This shared trauma created a bond among them that was unbreakable, but it also made them uniquely sensitive to the suffering around them. They saw the Russian peasants, starving and freezing, and they didn't see enemies, they saw people. But on patrol, empathy had to be buried under discipline. In the field, hesitation meant death. The tension between their gentle nature and their lethal training was a tightrope they walked every single day. The incident in question happened on a patrol near a small, abandoned settlement deep in the taiga. Intelligence reports had indicated heavy partisan activity in the sector. A squad of Philippine scouts had dug in for the night, creating a defensive perimeter in the snow. The temperature had plummeted, and the air was so still that the snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. A young private, whose name has been lost to official records but is remembered in oral history as Mateo, was on watch. He was barely 20, a boy who should have been courting a girl in his village, not shivering in a foxhole on the other side of the world. He was exhausted, his eyes playing tricks on him in the shifting moonlight. Suddenly, the shadows detached themselves from the trees. A group of men emerged from the forest edge, moving with the quiet confidence of experienced hunters. They were Russian partisans, heavily armed, rugged men wrapped in mismatched furs and scarves. They had stumbled upon the Filipino position, and the realization hit both sides simultaneously. There was no time to retreat. The Filipinos raised their Springfields, the Russians raised their Mosin-Nagants. It was a Mexican standoff at point-blank range. The distance between them was less than 50 yards, close enough to see the condensation of the enemy's breath, close enough to see the fear and the resolve in their eyes. The tactical situation was a nightmare. If one shot was fired, the muzzle flash would blind them, and the ensuing chaos would result in a bloodbath where everyone died. The sergeant of the Filipino squad hissed orders to hold fire, waiting for the Russians to make the first move. The Russian commander stood frozen, his hand hovering near the bolt of his rifle. It was a precipice. The adrenaline was pumping so hard it was almost painful. In these moments, humanity usually vanishes, replaced by the reptilian instinct to survive at all costs. The other ceases to be a person and becomes a target. The silence stretched on for seconds that felt like hours, a vacuum waiting to be filled by the roar of gunfire. Then, the impossible happened. Mateo, the young sentry, perhaps driven by a nervous breakdown, or a divine intervention, or simply the overwhelming weight of his own homesickness, slumped slightly against the icy dirt of his foxhole. He didn't tighten his finger on the trigger. Instead, he began to hum. It started as a low, trembling vibration in his throat, a sound of pure distress. His sergeant glared at him, terrified that the noise would trigger the attack, but Mateo didn't stop. The hum grew louder, finding a melody, and then, softly, he began to sing words. He wasn't singing a battle hymn. He was singing Dandansoy. Dandansoy is a Visayan lullaby, but calling it a lullaby simplifies its power. It is a song of farewell. The lyrics speak of a lover saying goodbye to his beloved Dandansoy, telling him that if he longs for her, he shouldn't follow her to the fields, but instead look towards the water. It is a song about leaving home, about the crushing pain of separation. As Mateo's voice rose, shaky but clear in the acoustic perfection of the frozen air, the melody drifted across the killing zone. Dandansoy, Bainta Ikao, Pali Akos Se Pio, Dandansoy, I leave you now, I go back home to Pio. The sheer absurdity of the moment was paralyzing. A brown-skinned boy in an American uniform, singing a tropical ballad to a group of Bolshevik revolutionaries in the snow. The effect was instantaneous and bewitching. The Russian partisans, men who had likely killed without hesitation in the past, did not fire. They listened. The melody of Dandansoy is in a minor key, haunting and sorrowful, a sound that transcends language. You do not need to speak Visayan to understand that the person singing is in pain. You do not need a translator to feel the weight of longing. The song bypassed the political indoctrination, bypassed the military training, and struck directly at the human core of the men in the woods. They lowered their rifles, inch by inch, their heads cocking to the side as if trying to catch every note. Mateo continued to sing, his eyes closed, tears likely freezing on his cheeks. He was pouring every ounce of his misery into the song, channeling the collective homesickness of his entire unit. The other Filipino soldiers, initially terrified, felt a shift in the atmosphere. The aggression was draining out of the air, replaced by a heavy, shared melancholy. For a few minutes, the war stopped. The ideology of the Red Army and the strategic goals of the American interventionists dissolved. What remained were just men, cold, tired, miserable men, who all desperately wanted to be somewhere else. The song became a bridge, a momentary truce constructed not by diplomats, but by the sheer vulnerability of one soldier. The Russian commander stared at Matteo for a long time. In Russian culture, the soul is often associated with deep, poetic sadness, a resignation to the harshness of fate. The Filipino countryman resonated with this frequency perfectly. It spoke to the Russian soul in a way a speech or a threat never could. The commander saw that these were not conquering imperialists. They were just boys lost in the snow, singing to keep the dark away. He made a decision that defied all military logic. He slowly slung his rifle over his shoulder, a universal gesture of standing down. He looked at his men, and with a subtle nod, ordered them to do the same. There were no words exchanged between the two groups. No treaties were signed in that clearing. The Russian commander simply raised his hand to his brow, not a sharp military salute, but a somber gesture of respect. He turned his back on the Filipino line, exposing himself to their fire, a display of ultimate trust. His men followed him, melting back into the treeline, their dark shapes swallowed by the white forest. They chose to walk away. They chose to let the song be the end of the encounter. The Filipinos watched them go, their fingers still frozen on their triggers, their hearts hammering against their ribs, unable to comprehend that they were still alive. This event is a striking example of the Christmas truce phenomenon, but it is unique because of the cultural dynamics at play. The Christmas truce of 1914 was between Europeans who shared a similar religious and cultural background. This encounter in Siberia was between men from opposite ends of the earth, separated by race, language, and climate. Yet, the music bridged that gap. It proved that the emotion of longing for home is the most universal human experience. It is the one thing that every soldier, regardless of flag or uniform, carries in his rucksack. Matteo's song stripped away the uniforms and revealed the humans underneath. The story of the lullaby spread quietly among the Philippine scouts. It wasn't the kind of thing you put in an official after-action report. Private Matteo sang a song, and the enemy left because it sounded insane. But it became a legend within the ranks, a source of immense pride. It reinforced the Filipino concept of pakikipagapwatao, the ability to see the humanity in others. The Filipino soldiers were already known for their musicality. They had formed bands in Vladivostok that played for the locals. But this was different. This was music as a survival mechanism, a shield that worked better than steel. The reputation of the Filipino soldiers in Siberia was generally one of kindness. Unlike some of the other interventionist forces who treated the locals with disdain or brutality, the Filipinos often share their rations with starving Russian families. They played with local children. They flirted with local women. They were the kind soldiers from the tropics. This reputation likely saved their lives more than once. In a guerrilla war, if the population likes you, you're less likely to be ambushed. If they see you as human, they might warn you of danger. The lullaby incident was the apex of this relationship, a moment where soft power completely eclipsed hard power. Why dandansoy? The choice of song is crucial. It is an anthem of migration. The Philippines has a history of its people leaving to find work, to fight, to survive. The sadness in the song is intergenerational. When Matteo sang it, he was tapping into a centuries-old reservoir of emotion. The Russians, living in a land of exiles and vast distances, understood the frequency of that sadness. It was a harmonic convergence of two cultures that deal with suffering through song. It was a moment where the vibration of the song matched the vibration of the land, creating a peace that defied the logic of war. As the months dragged on, the American intervention in Siberia crumbled. The Bolsheviks consolidated power, the White Army collapsed, and the Allied forces began their withdrawal. The Philippine scouts boarded their ships to return to the tropics, leaving the snow behind. They returned to a Philippines that was still an American colony, their stories of freezing temperatures and singing to the enemy treated as tall tales by their families. Water that turns to stone, their grandmothers would laugh. Singing to Russians, it sounded like a fever dream. The history of the expedition faded into obscurity, overshadowed by the looming specter of World War II. For decades, this story was buried. The textbooks focused on the politics, the generals, and the failures of the campaign. The human element was lost. But in recent years, historians and descendants of the veterans have begun to dig up the diaries and letters of that time. They found the photos of Filipinos in fur coats, the letters complaining of the cold, and the references to the power of their music. The legend of the lullaby has been pieced together from these fragments, a testament to the fact that history is not just about map lines moving, it is about the people on the ground. The legacy of that moment in the snow is profound. It challenges the traditional narrative of what it means to be a soldier. We are trained to think of heroism as an act of dominance, taking the hill, killing the enemy. But was Mateo not a hero? He saved his entire squad without firing a shot. He displayed a courage that is rare, the courage to be vulnerable in the face of death. He disarmed the enemy not by taking their weapon, but by taking away their will to kill. It suggests that there is a different kind of strength, one that is rooted in empathy rather than aggression. Consider the ripple effect. Because those guns didn't fire, dozens of men survived that night. They went home to Iloilo, to Manila, to Moscow, to Irkutsk. They had children. Those children had children. There are people walking the earth today who exist solely because a lullaby was sung in a forest in 1918. The threads of fate are incredibly thin, and sometimes they are held together by something as fragile as a melody. It forces us to wonder how many other tragedies could have been averted if we had found a way to communicate our shared humanity before pulling the trigger. This story also reclaims the agency of the Filipino soldier. For too long, they were seen as mere foot soldiers for the American Empire, voiceless and obedient. But in Siberia, they show that they were complex, emotional, and culturally distinct actors. They navigated a world of white supremacy and geopolitical chaos with dignity. They brought their culture with them and used it to survive. They were not just fighting for the U.S., they were representing the Filipino spirit, resilient, musical, and compassionate, on a global stage that was hostile to them. Dandansoy is still sung today in the Philippines. It is a staple of choral competitions and late-night karaoke sessions. But for those who know the history, the song carries a different weight. When you hear the lyrics now, you don't just visualize a lover leaving a village, you visualize a standoff in the snow. You see the breath, misting in the cold air. You feel the tension of the rifles. The song has become a historical document, a container for a memory that the world almost forgot. It is a reminder that art is not frivolous, it is a lifeline. In our modern world, where conflicts are often fought with drones and algorithms, the story of the lullaby feels almost mythical. We have lost the proximity to our enemies. It is harder to sing to a drone. It is harder to empathize with a blip on a radar screen. But the lesson remains relevant. We are increasingly polarized, increasingly taught to view the other as an existential threat. The story of the Filipino soldier in Russia asks us to look closer, to listen harder. It suggests that if we strip away the ideologies and the uniforms, we might find that we are all singing the same song of longing. The power of soft power, of culture, food, music, and art is often underestimated in international relations. We spend billions on defense, on hard power, but often it is a movie, a song, or a shared meal that actually changes hearts and minds. The Philippine Expeditionary Force was a military failure in terms of strategic objectives. They didn't stop the Bolsheviks. But in terms of human connection, they were a triumph. They left a legacy of kindness in a land known for its brutality. They proved that you can be a soldier without losing your soul. As we reflect on this story, it is a call to action for how we handle our own conflicts. We may not be facing Bolshevik partisans, but we face conflicts in our families, our workplaces, and our communities. When tensions rise, when the standoff happens, what is our reaction? Do we tighten our finger on the trigger, or do we find a way to hum? Do we choose escalation, or do we choose connection? It takes immense bravery to be the first one to lower the weapon. It takes immense bravery to sing when everyone else is shouting. The snows of Siberia have long since melted, covering the foxholes where Mateo and his squad shivered. The bones of the partisans and the scouts have returned to the earth. The world of 1918 is gone, but the truth of that night remains timeless. It is a beacon in the dark history of warfare, a small, glowing light that says, humanity can survive anything. It can survive the cold, it can survive the war, and it can survive the hate, as long as there is someone brave enough to remind us of who we are. So, the next time you hear a lullaby or a sad song drifting from a window, remember the Filipino soldiers in the Russian winter. Remember that music is more than just sound. It is the universal language of the heart. It is the thing that saved them, and in a way, it is the thing that saves us all. If this story touched you, if it made you see the history of war in a slightly different light, then the memory of those men has been preserved for one more day. Their song echoes on, not in the taiga, but in our collective memory. Thanks for watching.